This is this is yeah. Okay. So good evening, everyone. And most of you I see before me know who I am, but to those who don't, I'm Mervyn Russell. I'm a retired member of the Order of Ordained Ministry in the United Church of Canada, and also a continuing member on the roll of the British Methodist Church. And I attend St. John's United Church in Oakville. First of all, I'm going to give a recognition of the land on which I am present. I recognize that I and many others on this webinar are living on the lands and the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that there have at various times been other First Nations people on this land, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee peoples in particular. We acknowledge that all the prosperity of our settler society enjoys is based on the resources which were used by these first inhabitants of North America, and from whom settler society has claimed as their own. We commit ourselves to pray and act to develop respect, knowledge, justice, and reconciliation between our two peoples. So this evening's program is the first in a series of 3 illustrated presentations given by retired Professor Dan Epp-Tiessen of the Central Mennonite University in Winnipeg. And I'll introduce Dan more fully in a moment. After I've introduced Dan, and Dan will give about 40 minutes to his presentation, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. You can use the raised hand feature, which you'll find if you go to reactions at the base of your screen there, and use that raised hand feature, and we'll know that you have a question or a comment to ask. Or if you're more comfortable, put whatever you want to say into the chat. Again, you'll find the chat feature at the base of your screen. So it's, and obviously some people are willing to be seen and to be heard. If you don't want that to be the case, that's perfectly all right as well. So the role of so-called Christian Zionism in the founding and development of the State of Israel is an important one, both as regards the past and the present. For members of Christian communities, it's important that they know this history and to decide for themselves whether they think it's commendable or, on the other hand, reprehensible. Professor Dan will help us to understand what the issues have been and are for this involvement today. I'm going to read the brief bio that Professor Dan sent about himself. Dan Epp-Tiessen is retired from teaching Bible and theology at the Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg for 26 years. He's grateful for ongoing opportunities in congregations and the community to live out his vocation of teaching and preaching the Bible and Christian faith, especially without now assignments to work to mark in the evening. Dan is a member of the Mennonite Church Manitoba Palestine Israel Network and is active in solidarity efforts to resist Israel's settler colonial oppression of Palestinians and its genocide in Gaza. Dan enjoys gardening, bird watching, camping, biking, exercising, reading, and spending time with his wife Esther, as well as their children and grandchildren. Dan is an active member of Home Street Mennonite Church in Winnipeg, where he finds spiritual nurture, deep Christian fellowship, and opportunities to serve. Dan received his PhD from St. Michael's College, Toronto in 1994. He's been a lecturer at various seminaries in southwestern Ontario. He's taught Bible and theology from 1988 to 2023, first as an assistant professor and then as an adjunct professor at the Central Mennonite University in Winnipeg. He's published 2 books on Hebrew prophets and has written many articles, reviews, and resources on topics as varied as resurrection, homosexuality, and Palestinian rights. So it's now my great pleasure, Dan, to pass over to you for the first of your presentations.
Well, thank you very much, Mervyn, for that introduction and for making me look really, really good. So that's a good way to get started. And thank all of you for being here. And thank you for your interest in a very, very important topic. And I look forward to these 3 sessions together with you. How did we get from the Bible to genocide in Gaza? Um, there's many factors that lead to something as complex as the genocide in Gaza. History is generally more complex than it is simple. But I'm absolutely convinced that without the Bible, the current genocide in Gaza would not be happening. So in this series, we're going to look at sort of 3 tracks that lead from the Bible to the genocide in Gaza. Tonight, we're going to look at the Bible's land promises, all those passages where God promises to give the land to the Israelite people forever. And we're going to explore how that gets us to the genocide in Gaza. Next week, we're going to look at anti-Semitism, the long and ugly history of Christian anti-Semitism. Um, that used and built on New Testament passages that are critical of Jewish people, Jewish leaders. And it was that anti-Semitism that it inspired Jewish leaders to say, we need to get out of Europe. Europe's not safe for us. We need to create our own nation state in Palestine. But of course, Palestine was already fully occupied by other folks. And thirdly, we're going to look at Christian Zionism and how it reads the Bible and how that has helped to create the modern state of Israel and helps to sustain it. So that's where we're going in these 3 sessions. Okay, so by way of introduction, I'm going to be consistently using the term genocide. So I want to explain that a little bit. Oops. Okay, let me get. Okay, here. Using the United Nations definition of genocide, which involves the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Um, and that's what we see happening in Gaza. The attempt to make life in Gaza or make Gaza unlivable using means such as killing members of the group. By now, 68,000 people killed. That's the tip of the iceberg. That doesn't count all those people whose bodies are rotting under the rubble. It does include all of those people who died of diseases that could have been easily dealt with had Israel not prevented medicine from getting into Gaza. It doesn't include all the people who died of malnutrition, even starvation, all of those grandparents who starved themselves to death because when their family got any food, they said, we'll just give it to the grandkids, those kind of things. Then, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Well, 2 years of constant bombardment, 2 years of being forced to move from one place to the other, um, just ongoing mental harm and bo serious bodily destruction. Well over 100,000 people injured, many people living without limbs, etc., etc. Thirdly, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. One of the first things that Israel did after October 7th was to totally destroy Gaza's electrical grid, its water system, its sewage treatment system. It very quickly destroyed every university. A very intentional decision. Where are Gaza's future doctors, engineers, teachers, nurses, etc., going to come from? All those skilled people you need to have a decent society. A lot of the elementary, high schools were destroyed. Most of the farmland has been destroyed. And we've all seen these kinds of pictures, moonscapes of the destruction of something like 90% of the homes in in Gaza. And massive swaths of Gaza look like this with not a single structure standing. Hence the term uh, genocide. So, how did we get to this kind of cruelty in the 21st century? Um, Jeff Halper is. I'm just going to. There. Sorry, I just got something's not working quite right here for me on the. Mervin, can you see? You can see my PowerPoint, right?
No,
You can't.
no,
Can you see it now?
no,
No,
Okay.
we can't see it.
I am sorry about that. Let me try that again. So you weren't able to see it at all.
no. I wondered whether you were just going to be speaking for that part of the presentation, but you're
No,
obviously
I'm
trying to.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Okay, I'm okay. We tried this multiple times before you were all on, and it worked. So,
You are
okay.
still the co-host. Yep. You
Is it
should be
working
able to
now?
share. No,
It's not working now. Can you see the pictures now?
No, no, we don't see any pictures.
We saw one slide and then it disappeared.
Okay. Wow. Okay, something is not working here.
yeah, and I've changed all the settings so everybody can share, Dan, so you should be able to.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay, let me get the, okay. Okay, so now we're on the normal screen, and then I go share.
Ah,
There we go. We got you now.
Got me
we're,
now.
we're getting you
Good.
now. Yeah,
Okay.
there
There
we
you
are. There we
go.
are. There we are.
There you
Yeah.
But
go.
it's not full there. Now it's okay. There we go. I, I just did the same thing I thought I did 3 times earlier. Um, Sorry about that, but we've got it straightened out now. So, okay, there's the definition from the UN definition. Here's a couple of photos. I'm sure most of us have seen these kind of photos. Um, okay, so Jeff Halper is a Israeli Jewish activist of American background. Um, he uses the analogy. He says that Israel-Palestine is badly sick. And he says, when you're sick, if you go to a doctor because you got severe abdominal pain, the first thing you need is a diagnosis. Is your abdominal pain, is it from appendicitis? Is it from food sensitivities? Is it from colon cancer? Because without a correct diagnosis, you can't get treatment or you won't get the right treatment. And so, what's the correct diagnosis for helping us understand what the illness is in Palestine? What caused Hamas's prison break or its attack on Israel on October 7th? Right? And what was it that caused Israel's over-the-top response and the genocide we've seen in Gaza in the last 2 years? I mean, these are all symptoms of the illness in Palestine. So we need a diagnosis. And according to Jeff Halper, Palestine's illness is what he calls settler colonialism. And there's lots of academics that are now using that term to describe the illness in Palestine. So, what we're going to do now is I'm going to explain what is settler colonialism, and then I'm going to talk about how this settler colonialism is shaped by and informed by biblical passages, the biblical land passages. Okay, so settler colonialism is a process that created a certain type of nation state, like Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel. So if Palestine is sick with settler colonialism, so is Canada. Okay? And how did that happen? European powers, they conquered large tracts of land, filled them with settlers, and these settlers eventually took most of the land from the indigenous peoples, and the settlers created their own nation states. So there's two primary realities that created these states. One was colonization and settlement. Hence, these are called settler colonial states. That's very different, for example, than what happened in India, for example. India was conquered, colonized by the British Empire, but Britain didn't fill India with settlers. And so when India gained its independence from Britain, India is not a settler colonial state because in India, it's Indian people who own the land, who run the government. Settler colonial states are run by settlers. Okay, settler colonialism, once it gets established, it is a structure and a system that shapes the political, economic, social, legal, military realities in these nation states. And the system is set up to benefit mostly the settlers, and indigenous people often pay a big price. Think of Canada. Who owns the farmland in Canada? It's the settlers, right? Who controls the government, the economy, the court system, the educational system? And in Palestine, who controls the borders? Who controls the military system? Who controls the water resources? And how are these used to benefit whom? Largely Israeli Jews at the expense of Palestinians. Settler colonialism, it's also a tool of analysis that academics use, a tool of analysis to highlight how settler colonial states came into being and are maintained as a result of racism, colonialism, violent land theft, and other injustices inflicted on indigenous peoples. So settler colonialism as a tool of analysis highlights settler power and privilege and how indigenous people got shafted in the process. Okay, so some of the basic dynamics of European-rooted settler colonialism. Settler colonialism, I mean, it's been practiced in other contexts, but for us, what matters is European-rooted settler colonialism. During the era of exploration or colonization that began in the 1500s, Europe developed what's called the doctrine of discovery. And it was promulgated by the Catholic Church, by the Pope. There were actual pronouncements by the Pope that said that Europeans have the right to go anywhere in the world. And if the area isn't filled with Christians, then Europeans can conquer and claim the territories for themselves, regardless of who lives there. That's a doctrine of discovery. When Europeans so-called discover a territory, they can claim it for themselves. And of course, that's how Canada and United States were created. And the doctrine of discovery is still a powerful force in Canada. For example, in Canada, we have this idea of crown land. Well, land that you and I don't have land title to is designated as crown land. Well, why does the crown own that land? Why don't the indigenous people who lived here long before the Europeans came? Why isn't it indigenous land? It's because of the doctrine of discovery. Um, the Zionist movement, I should just explain that. Zionism was a movement among European Jews started in the late 1800s, and it was a movement to encourage Jewish people to move to Palestine in large numbers and create a Jewish state there. A Jewish state. Zionism was never interested in a binational, bicultural, multicultural state. The goal has always been to create a Jewish state in Palestine. So why did these Jewish Zionists in the late 1800s, why did they think that they had a right to go to Palestine and just simply claim the land for themselves and to establish their own Jewish state there? Because of the doctrine of discovery. It was in the air that Europeans breathed at the time. So the Zionists just simply absorbed this doctrine of discovery from their European context. Okay, another key feature or dynamic of settler colonialism, arrogance, racism, white supremacy. I mean, why do Europeans have the right to go anywhere and claim the land for themselves? Because they're better than anyone else. So to justify their conquest, colonization, the whole colonial era worked with this dichotomy of Europeans are enlightened, civilized, but the rest of the world is unenlightened, they're barbarians. And that justifies taking indigenous land, colonizing, conquering, because Europeans are so superior. So you can see that this is all based in a European arrogance, racism, and white supremacy. And in the late 1800s, this is in the water that Europeans are breathing. They're just absorbing this kind of mentality. And the Zionist movement also absorbed this sense of European white supremacy. And so the Zionists just assumed they had every right to go to Palestine and take over and displace the indigenous Palestinian communities there. Okay, European settlers, they move in and they claim we are sovereign here. We have the right to the land and its resources. And that leads to massive violence, land theft, and dispossession of indigenous peoples. And acquiring the land and its resources is the central goal of settler colonialism. And indigenous people are the obstacle. Um, so, when the settlers came to Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, Palestine, they said, we are sovereign here. The land belongs to us. And they just took it. So these kinds of mentalities that were so predominant in Europe in the whole colonial era, they just get absorbed into the DNA of the Zionist movement, and they shape how the Zionist movement treated Palestinians from the very beginning until even to this day. If you think of the deep racism, I mean, how much is the life of a Palestinian child in Gaza worth compared to the life of an Israeli Jewish child in Tel Aviv, just 30, 40 kilometers away, right? Jewish Israeli life is worth infinitely more than Palestinian life in Gaza. That's racism. Um, So, the kind of settler violence in the West Bank uh, and the building of settlements on Palestinian land reflects that deep, deep racism that Jewish Israelis are worth so much more than Palestinians. Imagine if somewhere in this world somebody had in the last 2 years killed 20,000 Jewish babies. Uh, Whereas in Gaza, there's been more than 20,000 Palestinian children killed, right? We know what kind of outcry there would be, but when you kill 100,000 Palestinians, well, they're just Palestinians. Um, so, okay, what happens then is that settlers create their own nation state, their own institutions, economic systems, security forces, armies, code of laws. And all of these are designed to protect the privileges of the settlers and to keep indigenous people weak and unable to challenge the power, privileges, land holdings of the settlers. And that's the situation in Israel, Palestine. It's also the situation in 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 Canada. Um, Then, settler colonialism seeks to erase indigenous peoples. And that doesn't necessarily mean to physically erase them, commit genocide, although far too often genocide did happen in the colonial project. Um, but to render indigenous people invisible, insignificant, or irrelevant. And this happens through a whole variety of different strategies, beginning with military conquest. And there's the strategy of, well, the land was empty, uh, um, which is, of course, rarely true. But that's how many of the European settlers thought of Turtle Island, have thought about North America. The land was empty. It's just waiting there for us to move in and cut down the eastern hardwood forests and create our farms or plow up the prairie grasslands for wheat fields. The land was empty. There's an early Zionist slogan that Palestine is a land without people for a people without land. In Europe, because of anti-Semitism, Jews were in most places not allowed to own land. So now here there was a land that didn't have people for this Jewish people that didn't have land. Well, that's of course a total lie because Palestine was full of Palestinians. But this is what I mean by erasing the indigenous population. I hope you will all get a chance to watch the CBC Fifth Estate documentary that was aired on Friday evening. Oh, and now the name is slipping me. Uh, um, it's just a wonderful expose of what the violence that settlers in the West Bank are inflicting on Palestinians there and how Canadian charities, for which you can get a tax receipt, are helping to fund the settlement enterprise. Anyway, in this documentary, they're interviewing a settler spokeswoman, and she talks about this one Palestinian village, and she says, "Oh, there were no Palestinians living there. It's now a Jewish village. There were no Palestinians living there." So that's what it means to erase the indigenous people. Um, it One of the forms of erasure that the state of Israel practiced was what's called the Nakba, an Arab word meaning catastrophe. In 1948, after the new state of Israel came into being, one of the first things it did was to commit widespread ethnic cleansing in order to pursue three key Zionist goals. One was simply to acquire the land from Palestinians, and secondly, to just erase a significant segment of the Palestinian population because the Zionist goal was always to create a Jewish state where Jewish people would dominate and be in charge. And so you have to get you have to get the demographic balance right, and that means you have to get rid of the Palestinians. So the Israeli army would visit village after village, would often kill a few people in a village, intimidate the population, and then demand that the people leave. In all, about 750,000 Palestinians were just simply forced across Israel's borders. Many of them still live, or their descendants live in refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. If you wonder why Hezbollah is such a big force in southern Lebanon, it's because there's by now hundreds of, 100,000 or more Palestinian refugees still living in southern Lebanon. Um, in total, about 1 million Palestinians lost their land, more than half the Palestinian population. 500 Palestinian towns, villages were just simply destroyed. In many places, Jewish settlers just moved into Palestinian homes, but there weren't enough Jewish settlers yet at this time. So the Palestinian villages were simply bulldozed so that the Palestinian people would not have homes to return to. Um, and so that's how erasure works. Um, and then in that process, indigenous concerns and interests are ignored, marginalized, um, and mapping becomes a key way that settlers erase indigenous communities and peoples. Settlers name the places. Or you think of a map of Canada, the standard map of Canada. What does it feature? It features the 10 territories, or sorry, 10 provinces and the territories. Well, so the map of Canada is already makes claims about who owns the land and who's in charge here. The provinces are settler creations. What if all of our maps of Canada focused on the maps would just list the traditional territories of the indigenous peoples, who were the first peoples of Canada? That would communicate something very, very different. So mapping is a classic form of erasure. So here we have a map of Palestine. You see the yellow-orange areas, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. These are Palestinian territories, although Israel has filled the West Bank with Jewish-only settlements. So but in Israeli schools, it's illegal to use this kind of a map. You have to use this kind of a map where the West Bank is erased. In Israel, people in the Israeli education system, you don't talk about the West Bank. You talk about Judea and Samaria. And you talk about Judea and Samaria as being part of Israel proper. So the maps that children are taught in school are a deliberate attempt to indoctrinate Israeli school children to believe that the entire land belongs to them, and to indoctrinate Israeli children into erasing the presence of Palestinians in Palestine. Okay. Settler colonialism has a bad conscience, as well it should, because it can only be created and sustained through huge amounts of violence. And of course, no people wants to think badly of themselves. They don't want to think about themselves as being cruel, violent people. We want to think of our ancestors as good and moral people. And so in settler colonial systems, there's massive amounts of denial about the violence and injustices. And we've seen that in Canada. I mean, the way I have a bachelor's degree in history, and the way I learned Canadian history, I didn't learn about all the treaty breaking. I didn't learn about residential schools in Canada till about 15 years ago. I didn't learn about the Indian Act and the horrible things that it decreed for Indigenous peoples in Canada. So there's been a huge amount of denial in our Canadian settler colonial system. Now, fortunately, in Canada, we're at a place where we're beginning to diagnose our illness, and we're beginning to, at least in small ways, treat it. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission that examined the residential schools and their legacy, of course, played a huge role in that. And so in Canada, I mean, I'm old enough to have seen massive, massive changes. And so we're moving in some positive directions at treating our settler colonialism. We're not moving nearly quickly enough, and there's a long, long way to go. Um, um, but in Israel, things are moving actually in the opposite direction. And Israel is becoming politically more and more right wing, partly because progressive folks are leaving the country because they don't want to raise their kids in that kind of environment. They don't want their 18-year-old sons and daughters to have to go into the West Bank and harass Palestinians. Um, and so Israel is just doubling down and becoming ever more settler colonialism. And that's vividly evident in terms of what the settlers are doing in the West Bank to Palestinians, in terms of beating Palestinians, committing violence, and stealing more and more land, and building more and more settlements. Okay, the bad conscience. This man, Ilan Pappé, written a fantastic book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It documents the Nakba. It documents how the Israeli military deliberately displaced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, destroyed their homes, stole their land. When his book came out in 2006, there was a massive outcry within Israel. Israeli Minister of Education demanded that the university where Ilan Pappé taught should fire him. Uh, there was massive pushback. He faced death threats. He eventually moved to England for an academic position there. Because in Israel, there is still this massive, massive denial about the violence of its settler colonial system, and especially the violence of the Nakba. Okay,
Uh,
point number, yes.
Dan, can I just mention in relation to that, Ilan Pappé's newest book, which is a very good introduction to all that you've been saying, which is a very concise history of the Israeli-Palestine conflict. I think it's
Great.
probably no more than about 200 pages, uh, excellently written because Ilan is a wonderful communicator. And if anybody wants to understand the basics, that would be an excellent place to start.
Anything Ilan Pappé does is good, is my experience. He's an excellent writer. He's often interviewed. He does videos, webinars. He communicates very, very well. He's very insightful, brilliant, great communicator. So, yeah, I'm a big fan. Yeah, thanks for that, Mervyn. Yeah. Okay, this point. Indigenous people will resist settler colonialism. And of course they will, because they love their land. They love their way of life. They want to preserve it. This resistance will often be nonviolent. Sometimes it will be violent. And it will meet with varying degrees of success. In Canada, we are very fortunate that Indigenous resistance has been almost exclusively nonviolent. And I'm often, when I hear stories from Indigenous people of the violence that they have experienced, the oppression that they have experienced, I am over and over again stunned by their commitment to nonviolence. So, and primarily now they're using the court system, which over and over again rules in their favor. Um, but Hamas is not committed to nonviolence. Hamas represents Palestinian resistance to Israeli settler colonialism. Uh, from the very beginning, as soon as Palestinians became aware of what the Zionists were up to, that the Zionist goal was to create a Jewish state in Palestine, Palestinians resisted, often violently. And there were often clashes, violent clashes between the early Zionists and Palestinians. Um, and whenever there are anti-colonial struggles, often those struggles will be violent. And these anti-colonial struggles will sometimes be viciously violent. If you read stories about the anti-colonial struggle in Mozambique to get the Portuguese out, or in Zimbabwe to get the white settler colonial regime out. These struggles, there's often huge violence and atrocities on both sides. So I don't for a moment justify the horrific violence that Hamas committed on October 7th. But I think one has to remember that that violence didn't come out of a vacuum, and the Western media as well. The war started on October 7th. No, that war did. The war started with the beginning of the Zionist movement. Um, October 7th was just one new stage in the long war against of Israeli settler colonialism against Palestinians. And Hamas represents an attempt to protect Palestinian claims to the land. The people in Gaza, almost all of them are descendants of people who were forced off their land during the Nakba. So the people in Gaza, they can look through the chain link fence and see the land that's now farmed by Israeli Jews that used to belong to their ancestors. And that's why they're so furious. And it's Hamas is an attempt to get the land back for Palestinians. Um, but when colonized people resist violently, the settlers will delegitimize that violence. They will say it's totally irrational, unmerited. I mean, these people are doing these things because they're barbarian or they're terrorists, right? That's the big claim about Hamas. They're terrorists. They're anti-Semites. Um, uh, there's no reason. I mean, Israel paints itself as a peaceful nation that just wants to live peacefully in Palestine because there's this complete denial about the violence that was involved in establishing the Israeli settler colonial state. And so then the state of Israel resorts to massive amounts of violence to suppress the indigenous Palestinian resistance, and it calls its genocide on Gaza virtuous self-defense. We are just defending ourselves from these Palestinian terrorists who are the latest incarnation of the Nazis. That's the rhetoric in that comes from the leading Israeli politicians. Um, okay, maybe I'll just pause for a little bit. Any questions about settler colonialism in general before we switch to talking about, so what does the Bible have to do with all of this? But any questions, reflections on what I've said about settler colonialism?
Hi, Cynthia here. Really enjoying the presentation. Very clear and extremely interesting. I didn't realize that the Palestinian state was Islamic. I never really thought about or about that, and so I guess that's one of the insights I had tonight was I was Googling up to try to understand what was meant by get some more background on the Palestinians. So it's just a reminder that knowledge is really important when we're listening to the news and whatnot, to understand what's going on. And I think it's sobering to see the parallel between, what's happening over there and what happens into some of the other countries that you've already mentioned, even here in Canada. So thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, just to say, Hamas is an explicitly Islamicist party. In other words, it is motivated religiously by Islam. It's very explicit about that. Palestinians, just to say a little bit about the Palestinian population, it used to be that 20% or so of the Palestinian population was Christian. But because of the hardships of the Israeli occupation, more and more Christians have been leaving Palestine until now the Christian population is down to something like 2% of the Palestinian population. hmm But
Hi, Dan.
yeah,
This is Osama speaking.
Okay, yes.
Hello. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I am Palestinian. My
Okay.
father, I have the birth certificate of my father in 1923, and
Mm,
it shows that it is older than the
mhm,
occupation of Palestine. Also, Palestine consists of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. My parents used to tell us that there was a neighbor, our Jews, Arab Jews. There was Arab Jews in Palestine, in Jaffa. We are originated from Jaffa. And I am very interested in your presentation. It will said what is happening in Palestine. And Hamas is not only Muslims, there are also Christians between them, because
okay.
also there is other resistance movement which all together join together with Hamas.
Hmm.
Hamas is a resistance movement, not as I presented it as a terrorist movement. If we are originated from Jaffa, and we were kicked out from Jaffa to the West Bank, and then in 1967 we moved again to Jordan. So we had a very tough life. I
Yeah.
thank you for presenting this very great presentation. Thank you once again. I would like to have a copy of it if possible.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for those comments. Yeah. Jaffa was a major Palestinian center, and it was one of the first that was ethnically cleansed.
Yes.
Um, and then, there was the big Nakba in 1948. And then in 1967, when Israel conquered the West Bank, there was a mini Nakba, and another 200,000 Palestinians were expelled. And a couple of villages close to Jerusalem were demolished and turned into what's called Canada Park.
Yeah.
And it's called Canada Park, built on land, villages that were destroyed after 1967. It was called Canada Park because the money for that park came from Canada and it was tax receipted.
Oh my
So
God.
Canada has played a significant role in Israeli settler colonialism. Yeah. So,
They
Mervyn.
even have found something
Dan, I
about
just
them.
wanted to mention that at the beginning of uh, Jewish Zionism, uh, the idea was to set up a Jewish state anywhere that the imperial powers would, in fact, allow this to happen. I mean, there was the
Yeah,
idea that it might be in Argentina. And then there was the idea that it might have been in what we call today Uganda.
right.
But those early Herzl and the others who were the founders of the Jewish Zionist movement found that the only place to which there was enthusiasm for a Jewish state was, in fact, in Palestine.
Hmm.
That enthusiasm was partial. Most Jews in Europe at that time did not want to go to Palestine. Why would they want to go to a place where it was said to be empty, which mostly desert, where there wasn't one decent river? They were far more interested in being where they kind of knew the kind of context in which they were used to living. So
Yeah.
um, really, um, this settlement of Israel was a very difficult thing to
Hmm.
achieve at the beginning, and really got its impetus, because, as you'll probably come to shortly, with the Nazi regime
Yeah.
and its intention to exterminate the Jewish people.
Yeah. Yeah. The impact of anti-Semitism, huge. And we'll talk about that next week. Yeah. The early Zionists, they toyed with the idea of, well, we could build our Zionist state in Argentina or Uganda, as Mervyn mentioned, which just illustrates how colonial it was in nature, right? We Europeans, we can go anywhere in the world and take over and create our state there. So it's a good illustration. Salma, I see you have your hand up.
Yes.
Yes, hi Dan. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very insightful and very well articulated. I just wanted to ask you for your insights or perhaps your perspective when it comes to the current standing of Canada. You mentioned like truth and reconciliation process that we're doing, but at the same time, we've seen our leaders come out and say that they support the Zionist movement. So I feel like there's a moral and political contradiction here, and I'm just curious to understand like how you would perceive this or what you think of
hmm
this.
hmm Yeah, the Zionist narrative of Jews fleeing anti-Semitism in Europe and creating this marvelous state of Israel in Palestine, just wanting to live peacefully there. That's a powerful narrative that has won the day in the West. And it's the narrative, yeah, it dominates Western consciousness. So when October 7th happens, then our Western politicians say, well, these terrorists attacked peaceful Israel, and Israel has a right to defend itself, right? That's the narrative that gets told in the West because the Western media, the Western politicians don't know their history, and they just give this simplistic analysis, and they don't do an accurate diagnosis of what is actually going on. So that's why it's so important that we have these kinds of conversations.
By the way, we are the Semitic people. If you
Yeah,
do the DNA of the Jews, you will find them non-Semitic. We have done the DNA. We are the Semitic people, and
I
we
know.
cannot be anti-Semitic.
That whole idea of the term Semite comes out of racial theories in the 19th century that have now been totally discredited. Um, and so in academics, nobody talks anymore about Semitic peoples. But the term anti-Semite has stuck. And it's a bad term, um, but it's what we got. We'll
Mr.
talk more
Trump
about that
using
next
it.
week. Yeah,
Mr. Trump using it.
yeah, I know, I know. Yeah. This is settler colonialism, uses its own religious resources to justify its own settler colonialism. Okay? So, but European settler colonialism then was shaped by the Bible. Because for centuries and centuries, Christendom dominated Europe, right? So at least in name, Europe was Christian, and in within Christendom, then, the Bible was an extremely authoritative book. And the Bible had a huge impact on uh, the whole formation of settler colonialism, the mentality, the colonial mentality that allowed settler colonialism to come into being. So, I need to share my screen again here, and I hope it works smoothly this time.
Yep,
There we are.
good.
Good, good. Okay, there we are. Okay. Now if I can just shift it. There we. Oh, yes. Okay, just wanted to show you this map. Um, the expansion of Israeli settler colonialism. So 1947, you see this map. The white areas are the maps where Jewish settlers were the majority. Hardly any of Palestine. And then the United Nations partition plan in 1947. The white areas was what the state of Israel was supposed to get. The green areas is what Palestinians were supposed to get. But because of the war that broke out in 1948, soon as the state of Israel declared itself, The Zionist forces made advances, and then the third map is how things sort of settled out until 1967, when Israel conquered Gaza. Gaza had been under Egyptian control until 1967, when Israel conquered it, and the West Bank had belonged to Jordan until 1967, when Israel conquered it. And of course, Israel never gave it back. And has been building settlements in the West Bank ever since. And so the final map there, you see these few little green dots where Palestinians still exercise control. So these maps show the ever advancing land grabbing or land taking of Israeli settler colonialism. And I remember I said the goal of settler colonialism is always to get the land. And we see that unfolding before our eyes. Okay, the Bible. We have lots of these passages. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to you and your offspring, I will give this land. Other passages like this. And this passage, interestingly, comes right after the book of Genesis talks about how the land is full of Canaanites. And yet God grants the land to Abraham and his descendants forever. And that creates what's called the promise and fulfillment theme. God makes these promises, and then the question is, how will these promises be fulfilled? And it's a long journey from God making the promises to fulfillment. There's a detour where the Israelites spend 400 years in Egypt. And then God liberates these Israelite slaves and leads them on a grand exodus. The goal of that exodus is, of course, the conquest and taking of Canaan. So this is a profoundly settler colonial narrative. It's all about invading Canaan, killing the indigenous inhabitants, and then taking over and settling the land. So, even before the Israelites arrive on the borders of Canaan, God promises, I will fight for you. And as a result of that, you will be able to annihilate the Canaanites and drive them out. So, in modern terms, this is a story of genocide, ethnic cleansing. It's a classic settler colonial narrative. And so when we get to the book of Joshua, there are many of these accounts of how the Israelites would attack a particular town, and with God's help, they would conquer it, and then they would slaughter all of the inhabitants. And then we get this summary statement in Joshua chapter 10 of Joshua, just conquering the whole area and with God's help and slaughtering all the Canaanites. Now, historically, we know this isn't accurate. Historically, we know the situation was much, much more complex. If you go to the next book in the Bible, the book of Judges, it's clear that there's Canaanites all over the place. So, the story is much more complex than this, but this is how the story is told, at least in the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua. And it was this vision and this version of the story that shaped the hearts and minds of European Christians. Um, and European Christians saw themselves as that Christians had replaced Israel as God's chosen people. And we'll talk more about that next week when we talk about Christian anti-Semitism. And so Christians were now God's chosen people. And that meant that all of these promises that God makes to the Israelite people in the Bible, they are really made to Christians. And so the European mentality during the whole era of colonization was, we are God's people and God gives us land. And what do God's people do? They can march into a foreign land and they can wipe out the indigenous inhabitants like the Israelites do in the book of Joshua, and they can conquer and take over. And that story had a huge impact on the European imagination, and it's the foundation for the doctrine of discovery that we talked about. And it provides the sort of vision and imagination for the European settler colonial enterprise. And so when Christian preachers came to Turtle Island, there's examples of Christian preachers in Canada and United States talking about the indigenous people as Canaanites. And of course, we know what settlers are supposed to do to Canaanites: get rid of them and take over the land. Okay, so this is the Bible then, and its settler colonial narrative played a huge role in generating European settler colonial ways of thinking. And and as I said, the Zionist movement emerged in Europe at a time when this way of thinking was deeply embedded in European culture and mindset, and the Zionist movement just absorbed these assumptions and convictions, and they became embedded in the Zionist DNA, and they shape Zionist actions to this day. Okay, so to understand, uh, okay, uh, to go into the history a little bit now and how some of this unfolded. To understand Jewish Zionism, it's important to understand. I'm going to share my screen again. There we go. It looks like it's working. Um, okay, Jewish diaspora. So in biblical times, the Israelite people lived in the land of Palestine. Okay, what happened? Okay, the Jewish diaspora is the spread of Jewish people, either voluntary or forced, beyond their homeland of Palestine. Okay, so long before Jesus already, there was widespread emigration of Jewish people, primarily to the urban areas of the Mediterranean basin, looking for better economic opportunities, because Palestine can be a pretty tough place to make a living. For example, Alexander the Great, Greek Empire, wanted to build a city in his own honor in Egypt called Alexandria. It still exists to this day. Well, if you're going to build a new city, you need people to live in it. So Alexander invited Jews to come and help build his new city, and many Jews took him up on the offer. And Alexandria in Egypt became a major center of Jewish population. By about the time of Jesus, estimates are 4.5 to 7 million Jews in the Roman Empire. Jewish people, children are a blessing from God, and so they had a large population. Only a very small minority lived in Palestine, probably somewhere around 1 to 2 million. Then, and as I said, most of these uh, left Palestine voluntarily. Okay, uh, the Roman Empire was not very kind to Jewish people, and Roman oppression spawned two major revolts against the empire. Um, and the Romans absolutely crushed these revolts, slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Jewish people, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, sold a lot of Jewish people into slavery. And after the second revolt, the retaliation was so harsh that the Romans forced almost all Jews to leave Palestine. Um, Now, this is important because part of the Zionist narrative is that Jewish people were forcibly exiled, forced out of Palestine against their wishes. Therefore, they have a right to return. Okay? Well, there's two problems with that. One, I mean, it's a partial truth. Yes, the Romans did force most of the Jews that were still living in Palestine out. But by that time, the vast majority of Jews had already left voluntarily. And secondly, I mean, this idea that you can go back to the territory where your ancestors lived 2,000 years ago and just simply take the land and take over, boy, that's ethically, that's going to get you where, right? I mean, in Canada, what if we'd say, Indigenous people can go back, can get the land back that their ancestors lived on? That would be the end of, white property ownership in Canada. Um, Okay, so for many centuries, the Jewish community in Palestine was very small, probably numbering less than 10,000. And those Jews living in Palestine got along well with their neighbors. There are lots and lots of stories, as somebody mentioned here before. Palestinians, Jews living side by side, very, very peaceably. And Judaism, on the whole, made peace with living in diaspora until the mid 20th century. Um, uh, and it's only after the Holocaust, and we'll talk about that in detail next week, that Jews thought now living in the land of Palestine was somehow central to their faith. That's a rather very new development. So, until very late in the 1800s, there was no movement among the Jewish people to organize a major return of Jewish people to Palestine. As I said, there was a small Jewish community, maybe in 1900, maybe around 20,000, um, with no aspirations to create a Jewish state. Um, Okay, so what changed? What then encouraged the Zionist movement? Okay, we've already mentioned anti-Semitism. In the 19th century, 1800s, there was a big surge in anti-Semitism in Europe, and Jews, quite rightly, felt we are not safe in Europe. And of course, the Nazi Holocaust would prove them very correct. And especially in the Russian Empire, there were massive pogroms, persecutions of Jewish people, and large-scale more than 1 million Jews left the Russian Empire. A lot of those came to the U.S. and some to Canada and also other places. The 19th century was the age of nationalism in Europe, which led to the formation of nation states that united people who shared an ethnic and cultural identity. Hungary for the Hungarians, Germany for the Germans. And some Jewish people began to argue we also need a Jewish state, just like other peoples have their state. And then another factor that mentioned several times, the Jewish acceptance of the problematic ideas that undergirded settler colonial projects elsewhere. And God's promises in the Bible to grant the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants, as well as the long history of Israelite people in the land of Palestine. And as Mervyn mentioned, initially the Zionist movement at least somewhat considered other options, but clearly because of Jewish scripture, Jewish faith, if the Zionist movement was going to get any traction at all, it would have to be Palestine, the land of the Bible. Okay, Theodor Herzl, father of modern Zionism. There were a number of different people who kind of independently got the idea of we Jewish people, we need our own state to keep us safe. But Herzl was the one who really put wheels on that dream. He dedicated his whole life to actualizing the Zionist dream. So he traveled all over Europe, sharing his vision with Jewish leaders, meeting with politicians to try and get them their support, get them on board, doing fundraising with wealthy Jewish business people, bankers. He organized committees all over the place to actualize the Zionist dream, and he's widely recognized as the father of the Zionist movement. In 1897, he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. This was a gathering of people who were excited about the Zionist project, to start organizing. How are we going to make this happen? And they started the World Zionist Organization to promote the goals of Zionism, and they began to fundraise around the world to raise money to buy land in Palestine and to help Jewish settlers move there. Oh, sorry. Okay, we've talked about this one already, about other pos. Okay. Um, yeah, so in settling on Palestine, the Bible's land promises and the Bible's history of the Israelites in the land, um, it meant that if they're going to be a Zionist state or Jewish state, it would have to be in Palestine. Yeah, Mervyn.
Yeah, just to point out that Herzl uh, was not a religious person.
That's right.
This wasn't for religious reasons that Herzl wanted uh, to establish a Jewish state. It was to provide security for Jewish people and to be able to develop their own identity and culture. And so many of I mean, there were various varieties of Zionism, but the political Zionism, which has been dominant, has never been a religious movement.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The early Zionists were almost all secular, largely secular. So their reasons had nothing to do with Jewish faith. Their reasons had to do with Jewish nationalism and anti-Semitism, keeping Jews safe. And in fact, it was religious Jews who were the most resistant to Zionism. There were hopes that, yes, someday there would be a powerful Jewish state in Palestine, but that would only be in the day of the Messiah. And the Messiah would be the one to create that state. And so most religious Jews did not support the Zionist movement for that reason, because it was human arrogance, humans taking on the role of God's Messiah. The
Some think
Holocaust
it's,
changed.
in fact, a blasphemy.
Right, right. The Holocaust changed all of that. And that's what we'll talk about next week.
What is
Okay.
the Messiah then?
The Messiah is God's special king who will bring about the salvation of God's people. Yeah. Hmm. Okay, I said earlier that the Zionist movement sort of absorbed Europe's racism. I just want to give you a couple of examples of that. So here's Herzl from the record of his conversations with the Grand Duke of Baden. So Jews returning to their historic fatherland would do so as representatives of Western civilization, right? The West represents civilization, I love this, bringing cleanliness, order, and well-established customs of the Occident to this plague-ridden, blighted corner of the Orient. So here you get that dichotomy. Europe is civilized and clean and orderly. Non-Europe is barbarian, uncivilized, blighted, plague-ridden. And Europeans have this obligation to bring their civilization and cleanliness to other parts of the world. Um, then uh, Herzl and the other early Zionists, they knew very well that Palestine was not empty, that it was full of Palestinians. And so they knew that they were going to have to deal with that was going to be a problem for them, because the goal was always a Jewish state. So here's what he writes in his diary at one point. Once Jews have occupied the land and expropriated the private property. Notice the goal. We're getting the land. And once we've done that, we're going to have to deal with the folks who used to live on the land. We shall endeavor to expel the poor population across the border, unnoticed, right? Now notice this is what he writes in his diary. This is not what he was saying to the European politicians that he was going to lobby, that he was lobbying. Uh, Publicly, the Zionists are saying, "Oh, we're going to build this great economy and this great country and society in Palestine, and it's going to benefit the Palestinians." But in private, this is the kind of thing the Zionists are talking to each other about. Their goal from the get-go was get the Palestinians out. So we're going to expel the poor population across the border, but we're going to do it quietly because the West won't like it. Procuring employment, well, we'll get them jobs. In the transit countries, that just means the countries where they're going to kick them out to. But we're not going to give them jobs in our own country. Because the whole goal is to create a Jewish state. Okay, so I think I'll leave it my presentation, my sort of formal presentation there for today. Let's see. Yeah, the basic thing for today is Israel is a settler colonial state that is taking more and more land from Palestinians up to this very day. And the goal, I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu has made it very clear the goal is to take all of the West Bank. And indigenous people will always resist settler colonialism. And Palestinians are a strong, proud people with a high degree of self-respect, and they are capable of great resistance to Israel's settler colonial project. The genocide in Gaza is Israel's, in my opinion, over-the-top response to Hamas's resistance to Israel's settler colonialism. And I don't know how much you folks care about the start of the Blue Jays game, but I'm willing to spend a few more minutes in conversation. Okay.
It's a great presentation, Dan. I enjoyed it very much, and I learned a lot from it this evening.
Yeah.
And
I
and
mean,
to
I didn't
everybody,
know about
including you, Dan,
perseverance.
no score.
No score. Okay.
Just to also mention, I mean, some of the original maps that the early Zionists drew up for their Jewish state not only included the West Bank, but included the East Bank. In fact, the borders of Israel have never been settled, and that obviously is clear from if you're going to annex the West Bank, if you're going to annex the Golan Heights, it's an expansionist project. And indeed, some of the maps even thought of going as far as the Euphrates River, and some of Mr. Netanyahu's extremist supporters support that idea, because in parts of the Bible, under the Davidic Solomon
Right.
kingship, in fact, Jewish control did exert as far as the Euphrates River. So this project of claiming the land isn't by any means over, as far as some kind of messianic Jews are concerned.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. There were some early Zionists who, I mean, their Jewish state was going to be much bigger than Palestine. And it's fascinating, right? When there was the regime change in Syria, oh, when was that? When Bashar al-Assad was thrown out, immediately Israel took some Syrian territory and invaded parts of Syria and took territory. And
And
I'd be
Mr. Trump
surprised.
gave them the Golan Heights.
Exactly. Israel does not give land back.
No.
Once its soldiers are there, um, they usually stay. Yeah.
They took also part of Lebanon.
Yeah.
And he wants also the East Bank. He wants to take some of Jordan, some of Saudi Arabia, some of Iraq. He wants to take from the river of Furat up to the river of Nile. That's his big Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you see, I mean, this is settler colonialism, right? Expansion, expansion, expansion. Get the land, get the land.
And nobody able to stop him.
Well, they're able to, they don't want to, you know? I mean, the genocide in Gaza, I mean, it was completely enabled by the United States, right? If Joe Biden would have said, "We're not sending you one more bomb," Israel had run out of bombs. They dropped so many bombs on Gaza, they ran out in a month or two.
Yesterday,
And if
153 tons he threw in Gaza
I
because
know,
of accident happened by his soldiers in Rafah. He accused the Hamas and he
yeah,
bombarded Gaza by 150 tons of bomb.
yeah, yeah,
That's insane.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, so there's all kinds of reasons why the United States, supports and bankrolls the Israeli settler colonial project.
And part of the problem is having invested in so much. I mean, 7.3 billion a year
Right,
invested. It exceeds any aid to any other country,
right.
the whole total of any other countries. I mean, no wonder it's managed to do what it has. But I mean, when you've done that year after year after year after year, and now you've got to say we were wrong.
Hmm.
That's a very difficult thing to say to the population. We spent all your treasure, and in the end, we were wrong.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Years and years of foreign policy. You don't overturn that in one fell swoop. Hmm. Hmm.
So
Good
are
thing
we?
that
We?
our prime minister wants to arrest Netanyahu if he comes to Canada.
Well, and part of the problem is that Canada won't stand up for what's right because Canada desperately wants a trade deal with the US. And we know how Donald Trump responds when anybody disagrees with him. And so, Mark Carney is not going to stand up to the US on Palestine issues.
Are there any other people who haven't spoken so far who want to put a question to Dan or make a comment? Just raise your hand if you want to. Okay. Well, I want to thank Dan for his very interesting presentation this evening, and I think having the slides has been very helpful in fixing that firmly in our minds. And so, Dan, thank you very much for
You're
that
welcome.
first of your presentations. I also want to publicly thank St. John's United Church for sponsoring this series. It went to the church council, and the church council endorsed it, and that is why we're able to put it on in the name of St. John's United Church. I also want to thank Cindy McQuaid, who's been our host for this evening, and indeed goes so far as to say our co-promoter for this series. So if you've really found this presentation to be really worthwhile, please make the next two known to your family and friends. I'm sure Dan will do a little bit of recapping at the beginning of the next session, so it'd still be worthwhile coming on into these next two that are to occur this coming Friday and the Friday after that, October 27th and November 2nd. And thank you all for
They're
your
Mondays,
attendance.
Mervyn. They're Mondays,
Mondays.
not Fridays.
Oh, beg your
And
pardon.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon.
and I have recorded this, so anybody that may have missed it and want to listen to it, please just email me directly and I can send you the recording.
Okay, very good. And as I say, my wife is one of those, and I'm sure there may be other people too who would have liked to have been here this evening, but for various reasons could
I would
not.
like to thank you, Mervyn, for inviting us for this great presentation. And I would like to have a copy to teach my family on this.
Right. Well, once we
How
get
do
the
I send
recordings, we'll make sure you get
an
it on
email?
summer. Yeah.
Mhm.
Summer was with me a couple of Fridays ago, talking about the situation in Gaza with our local MP,
Oh, good.
Sima Akan. She is of Turkish origin, the first actual person of Turkish origin to sit in the House of Commons, a Muslim person, but with other religions in her background, her ancestry as well. So we had a good reception. What we found was that when we were pressing her about following through on the recognition of Palestine as a state, that there was a lot of hesitation,
Yeah.
foot dragging on doing the kind of things would be necessary to indeed show respect for the citizens of this state and for the territory of this state. So I'm afraid that this recognition of Palestine as a state may be just another instance of what I call gesture politics.
Mhm.
Anyway, thank you very much for your attendance, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good night's sleep and be refreshed for tomorrow. So good night.
Shalom.
Thank you. Shalom.